It's July 17th, 1996. The sun is setting over JFK. A Boeing 747 sits on the tarmac, waiting. It's been sitting there for 79 minutes. The air is thick and hot, 82 degrees, and two air conditioning packs under the belly of the plane are running full blast. Inside a tank near the center of the wing, something is happening. Not a bomb. Not a missile. Just heat. A nearly empty fuel tank, and a wire that shouldn't have been where it was. 12 minutes after takeoff, 230 people are dead. And within days, hundreds of witnesses are telling investigators they saw a missile streak up from the ocean and hit the plane. The FBI opens a criminal investigation. The CIA makes an animation. Conspiracy theories spread across the country. And for almost 4 years, the real answer sits buried under thousands of pieces of wreckage on the floor of the Atlantic. So what actually brought down TWA Flight 800? And why did so many people, including federal investigators, spend years chasing the wrong answer? Let's go back to that tarmac. The aircraft was a 25-year-old Boeing 747-131, registration N93119. It had been flying since November 1971. By the summer of 1996, it had logged roughly 93,000 flight hours and more than 16,000 pressurization cycles. The crew was experienced. The captain had 18,700 total flight hours, more than 5,500 of them on the 747. The Czech captain in the right seat had 17,200 hours. These weren't rookies. This was one of the most experienced flight decks you could put on a transatlantic crossing. They were supposed to leave for Paris in the early evening. Instead, they sat. A 79-minute ground delay, engines off, air conditioning running. Outside, it was a warm New York summer day. That detail, the air conditioning, matters more than it sounds. Mounted directly under the center wing tank were two air conditioning packs. When they run, they generate heat. That heat transfers upward, right into the bottom of the tank. On this particular 747, the center wing tank had almost no fuel in it. About 135 kilograms, roughly 170 liters, sitting in a tank designed to hold close to 50,000 liters. Less than 0.5% full. That sounds safe. It isn't. An almost empty fuel tank is actually more dangerous than a full one. When there's almost no liquid fuel, the space above it fills with vapor. And vapor is what burns. After 79 minutes of heat from below, the air-fuel mix inside that tank had moved into the flammable range. This wasn't unusual. Investigators later found that center wing tanks on planes parked near air conditioning equipment sit in the flammable range roughly 30% of the time. Across all fuel tanks on all airliners, it's about 7% of the time. The industry knew this. The design philosophy wasn't to prevent vapor. It was to prevent any spark from getting in. That's where the second problem comes in. Inside every fuel tank on a commercial airliner are probes that measure fuel quantity. They're called Fuel Quantity Indicating System probes, or FQIS probes. They work by measuring electrical capacitance. They're designed to carry almost no energy, just 0.02 millijoules. The minimum energy needed to ignite jet fuel vapor is 0.25 millijoules, more than 12 times higher. On paper, the system had a safety margin built in. But here's where it gets complicated. On early Boeing 747s, the wires running to those FQIS probes were bundled together in the same wire harnesses as much higher voltage wires. Wires carrying real power. There was no FAA requirement to keep them separate. McDonnell Douglas had already figured this out and required at least a 3-inch separation between FQIS wires and high-voltage wires on their aircraft. Boeing had no such rule. That gap in the rules had been sitting there for decades. And the wires themselves had another problem. The FQIS probes use silver-plated copper wire. When silver-plated copper is exposed to sulfur compounds in jet fuel over years and years, it forms a coating called silver sulfide. Silver sulfide acts like a semiconductor. It lowers resistance. It makes arcing more likely. Investigators found it on this plane. They also checked 26 other in-service airliners after the accident. Nearly every single one had serious wiring problems, including wires that had previously arced, melted together, and self-extinguished without anyone knowing. So on the evening of July 17, 1996, you have a tank full of flammable vapor, FQIS wires running alongside high-voltage wires, and silver sulfide deposits on the wiring inside the tank. At 20:31:12 local time, a voltage spike, most likely from a short circuit involving one of those high-voltage wires, traveled into the center wing tank. The silver sulfide deposits did the rest. An arc jumped. The vapor ignited. What happened next took about 3 to 5 seconds. The explosion inside the center wing tank wasn't a detonation. It was a deflagration, a flame front moving at subsonic speed rather than supersonic. But it didn't need to be supersonic to destroy the plane. The overpressure was enough to fracture the keel beam, blow apart the wing box structure, and separate the entire nose section from the rest of the aircraft. 80,000 pounds of nose gone, just like that. The tail-heavy remnant of the plane, engine still running on the wings, pitched up sharply. It climbed. From 13,000 feet, it rose another 2,000 to 3,000 feet, reaching nearly 16,000 feet, trailing fire the entire way. Then it stalled, rolled right, and fell into the Atlantic Ocean. That climbing, burning shape is what hundreds of people on Long Island and the South Shore saw that night. And they called it a missile. You can understand why. Something streaked upward. It was on fire. It moved fast. If you don't know that a 747 with its nose missing can still generate lift and pitch skyward for half a minute, what you saw looks exactly like a surface-to-air missile climbing toward a target. Witness reports flooded in. More than 700 people reported seeing something. Many described a streak of light rising from the water. The FBI treated this seriously. A criminal investigation was opened. The CIA, trying to explain the witness accounts, produced an animation showing what the post-breakup flight path actually looked like from the ground. The conclusion was that witnesses had seen the burning plane climbing, not a missile approaching it. But by then, the alternative narrative had taken hold. Here's what the physical evidence actually showed. Investigators recovered nearly 98% of the wreckage. They reassembled it in a hangar, piece by piece, thousands of fragments laid out in the shape of a 747. What they found was unambiguous. The skin of the center wing tank had peeled outward. The soot patterns inside the tank were consistent with an internal fire. The structural failures radiated outward from the center. What they did not find was any trace of high explosive residue. No shrapnel pitting, no fragment signatures. For comparison, Malaysia Airlines MH17, shot down over Ukraine, showed clear shrapnel pitting across the forward fuselage. The pattern is unmistakable. On TWA 800, it wasn't there. Not faint, not ambiguous. Absent. The investigation took nearly 4 years. The NTSB's final report named the probable cause as an explosion of the center wing tank, ignited by a short circuit that sent excess voltage into the FQIS wiring. The FBI closed its criminal investigation. No evidence of a missile. No evidence of a bomb. No evidence of any external device. The conspiracy didn't die, though. It never does. A group of former investigators publicly disputed the findings years later, claiming the evidence had been misread. The NTSB reviewed their claims and found nothing that changed the conclusion. The physical record was too complete, too consistent, and too thoroughly documented to reinterpret. But here's the real question the investigation forced the industry to answer. How had this been allowed to happen in the first place? The NTSB identified 26 cases of fuel tank explosions on transport aircraft between 1959 and 1996. 26. The 1990 Philippine Airlines 737 center tank explosion at Manila Airport killed 8 people and injured 82 more, likely caused by a damaged FQIS wire. Pan Am Flight 214 lost a wing tank to a lightning strike. A Royal Iranian Air Force 747 went down near Madrid in 1976 after lightning hit a fuel tank. The pattern was there. The industry had accepted vapor flammability as a manageable condition and trusted that ignition sources could always be controlled. TWA 800 proved that trust was misplaced. The regulatory response was sweeping. New wiring inspection and maintenance standards were mandated across the fleet. Wiring separation rules were tightened. And most significantly, fuel tank inerting systems were required. These systems pump nitrogen into fuel tanks, displacing the oxygen-fuel vapor mix and making ignition physically impossible. By around 2018, virtually every commercial airliner flying had one. The tank that killed 230 people in 1996 simply cannot exist on a modern airliner. That's not a small thing. Every long-haul flight you take today carries a system that didn't exist as a requirement before July 17, 1996. The accident also changed how investigators think about aging aircraft wiring. Before TWA 800, wires were inspected visually when something went wrong. After, the industry learned that wiring can arc, melt, and self-repair without triggering any warning. Silent degradation. The kind you only find when you're looking specifically for it, not when you're fixing something else. 230 people boarded that plane for Paris. They had no way of knowing that a 25-year-old wire, coated in a compound formed by years of contact with jet fuel, was sitting inches from a wire carrying real voltage, inside a tank that had been slowly heating for an hour and 20 minutes on a summer afternoon. Nobody made a decision to let them die. There was no villain. There was a gap in a rule that nobody had closed, a degradation process nobody had treated as urgent, and a design philosophy that assumed the last line of defense would always hold. It didn't hold on July 17, 1996. And every plane flying over you tonight is safer because it didn't. The 4-year investigation itself is worth sitting with for a moment. Because what the NTSB did with TWA 800 wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented in scale. They pulled wreckage from the Atlantic floor for months. Divers working in murky water, recovering fragments the size of a hand and pieces the size of a car door, cataloging everything. The reconstruction team in the hangar at Calverton, New York worked for years, hanging recovered sections from a steel frame, rebuilding the ghost of a 747 from the inside out. Nearly 98% of the airframe eventually accounted for. That level of physical reconstruction had never been done before on a commercial accident of this size. Why does that matter? Because it meant there was almost nowhere for an alternative explanation to hide. If a missile had hit that plane, the evidence would be in the metal. Shrapnel from a proximity-fused warhead punches into aluminum at a specific angle, at a specific velocity, and leaves a signature that metallurgists can read like a fingerprint. It was not there. If a bomb had been placed in the cargo hold or the cabin, the blast seat, the pattern of primary damage would point directly at the source. It was not there either. What was there, consistently and repeatedly across thousands of pieces of recovered structure, was the signature of an internal pressure event originating in the center wing tank. The forensic case wasn't built on a theory, it was built on metal. And yet the conspiracy persisted. Part of that is human nature. When 230 people die on a clear summer evening 12 minutes after takeoff, the idea that it was caused by an old wire and a maintenance gap feels insufficient. It feels like the scale of the tragedy demands a larger cause. A missile is a decision. Someone chose to fire it. That's a story with a villain, a motive, a meaning. A silver sulfide deposit on a 25-year-old wire is just a failure, quiet, unglamorous, and in some ways harder to accept. But the scale of a cause and the scale of its consequences have never been required to match. Small things fail catastrophically all the time in aviation. That's the entire reason the industry built redundancy into everything. TWA 800 was a reminder that redundancy only works when every layer of it is actually in place. The wiring separation rule was a missing layer. It had been missing since the first 747 rolled out of Everett, Washington in 1968. For 28 years, nobody had made it mandatory. Not because anyone decided it was acceptable to skip. Because the question had never been forced into focus the way a 747 falling into the Atlantic forces a question into focus. There's a version of this story where the 1990 Manila explosion changes everything. A Philippine Airlines 737 sitting at the gate, center tank ignition, 8 people dead. That was 6 years before TWA 800. The cause was suspected to be a damaged FQIS wire. The connection to vapor flammability and wiring was visible, if anyone was looking hard enough. The industry looked, made some notes, and moved on. The regulatory gap stayed open. This is the pattern that accident investigators see again and again. Not a sudden failure. A slow accumulation of near misses and partial warnings that never quite reach the threshold to force action. Then one day the conditions line up perfectly, and the gap that was always there becomes the gap that kills people. TWA 800 was that day for fuel tank safety. The nitrogen inerting mandate that came out of it took years to implement across the global fleet. The technology existed before the accident. Military aircraft had used fuel tank inerting for decades, specifically because combat damage to fuel systems is a known risk. The commercial aviation industry had considered it and decided the cost wasn't justified given the perceived low probability of ignition. TWA 800 recalculated that probability. The cost of not fitting inerting systems suddenly looked very different when measured against 230 lives and a 4-year investigation. By 2018, the mandate was effectively complete. Every new airliner certified after a certain point had to have it. Older aircraft were retrofitted on a rolling schedule. The system works by generating nitrogen from filtered cabin air and pumping it into the ullage, the empty space above the fuel in the tank. Nitrogen is inert. It can't support combustion. The vapor is still there. The ignition source might still be there. But without oxygen in the right concentration, nothing happens. It's a simple concept. Getting it onto every commercial aircraft in the world was anything but simple. And it only happened because of what fell into the Atlantic on July 17, 1996. The wiring reforms were equally significant, even if they got less attention. The post-accident inspection of 26 in-service airliners found problems that should not have existed. Wires that had arced and melted together and nobody knew. Insulation that had cracked and bridged across adjacent circuits. These weren't on old neglected planes. They were on aircraft in regular service, maintained by professional teams following approved procedures. The procedures just weren't designed to catch what was actually happening inside aging wire bundles. New inspection protocols came out of that finding. Enhanced zonal analysis, specific attention to wire routing near fuel system components, requirements to separate FQIS wiring from high-voltage circuits with physical barriers, not just routing guidelines. The kind of rules that McDonnell Douglas had already written for their own aircraft, now applied across the board. The captain of TWA 800 remarked on the fuel flow to Paris just before the explosion. It was a routine comment, the kind of thing an experienced crew says during climb as they cross-check the gauges. The cockpit voice recorder captured it. 12 seconds later, the recording ends. There was no warning, no alarm, no time to respond to anything. The crew did everything right. The plane had been killing them slowly for 25 years without anyone knowing it. That's the hardest part of this accident to sit with. Not the conspiracy theories, not the regulatory failures, not even the scale of the loss. It's the fact that a crew with tens of thousands of hours of experience between them had no way to know what was sitting underneath their feet. The danger was invisible, embedded in the structure of the aircraft, and it had been there since the day the plane was built. Aviation is built on the idea that you can find the failure before it finds you. TWA 800 is a case where that idea failed completely, and the industry had to rebuild part of its foundation in response. The 230 people on that flight were going to Paris. Some were students on a school trip. Some were families. Some were crew members who had flown that route dozens of times. None of them are here to see the nitrogen inerting systems now standard on every airliner, or the wiring separation rules that exist because of what happened to them, or the inspection protocols that have almost certainly prevented failures that never made the news because they were caught before they became accidents. The answer to what brought down TWA 800 was never buried. It was in the metal, in the hangar at Calverton, waiting to be read. The investigation found it. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent and real. What the conspiracy theories were really asking wasn't what caused the explosion. They were asking for a cause that felt equal to the loss. There isn't one. There's just a wire, a tank, a summer afternoon, and a rule that should have been written in 1968.